Welcome to the screencast, Structuring and Writing a Thesis. This is part 2 of 3, the abstract and introduction. Let's first review the learning outcomes for part 2. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to incorporate the Create a Research Space or CARS model into your proposal and thesis, write a clear and well-organized abstract, and a clear and well-organized introduction. And here's a brief overview of the screencast. First, we'll define and explain the Create a Research Space or CARS model. Then we'll explain how this model works in an abstract and look at the parts of a model abstract. After that, we'll explain how the CARS model works in an introduction, and then look at the parts of an abbreviated model introduction. Finally, we'll discuss what makes good research questions, objectives, and hypotheses. Well, what do we mean by creating a research space, or CARS for short? Well, John Swales and Christine Fig suggests that theses and research papers should create a research space for the new research being proposed. And they developed the CARS model to help you create a research space for your own research. So the CARS model is actually a method for organizing parts of a thesis or a research paper. And you actually see the CARS model at work in each of these sections, in the abstract, in the introduction, and in the literature review. And Swales and Fig identified 3 moves in the CARS model. The first is to establish the broad research territory, then to identify a niche within that research territory, and finally to occupy the niche that you've identified. So just a little bit more about establishing a research territory. You do this by demonstrating that the research area is central, problematic, or relevant, and you present background information or give the context about the topic or problem. And you review and synthesize previous and current related research. Then move 2 is identifying a niche. And you do this by using one of the following strategies. You announce a gap or shortcomings in the existing research or a real-world problem. You question the findings or methods of the existing research. Or you indicate your intention to continue a research tradition. And I actually find that in most theses, a gap or shortcomings are announced or findings or methods are questioned. Not many students indicate an intention to continue a research tradition. The final move, the third move, is occupying a niche. And you do this by stating the nature and purpose of your research, then listing research questions, hypotheses, or objectives, announcing research findings in a thesis, or expected findings in a proposal. And you may then state the value of your research, which Swales and Fig indicate is optional. And you may indicate the structure of the paper or proposal. This too is optional. And actually, I don't see this in many theses. Let's now talk about the abstract. Well, most abstracts have a funnel shape. They are organized from the general to the specific, and they follow the order of the CARS moves. They briefly establish the research territory by indicating the background or the problem. Then they identify the niche, usually the research gap or shortcomings in the existing research. And then finally, they occupy the niche by stating the purpose of the research, the methods, the findings, in the thesis only, and the significance of the research. And according to the College of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies, the abstract should not exceed 350 words. And just bear in mind that abstracts do not have references. What I'd like to do now is read this abstract from a student's proposal, a PhD proposal, and identify the 3 CARS moves. Response of high mountain snow and ice hydrology to a changing climate. Being sensitive to climatic conditions, cold regions in high mountains reliably indicate climate change. These changes include retreating glaciers and shrinking snow cover, which reduce the downstream water supply. Although it is known that climate change is causing glaciers to retreat, the magnitude of climate change impacts on glaciers and streamflow is not well understood. The purpose of this research is to develop a greater understanding of the impact of climate change on mountain glaciers by applying a physically based melt model coupled with a blowing snow redistribution model within the cold regions hydrological model platform. A new glacier melt model will be developed based on hydrometeorological observations at Peyton Glacier in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. This model will improve knowledge of climate change impacts on downstream water resources in the Canadian Rockies. The model will apply to mountainous areas throughout the world that are facing potential water shortages and other problems due to climate change. Well, let's look at the 3 moves. You probably noticed that the first 2 sentences establish the research territory by giving the background and announcing a topic and giving a bit about the background. And then the student immediately moves into the gap here by saying that the magnitude of climate change impacts on glaciers and streamflow is not well understood. So we have the identification of the niche right here. Then the student occupies the niche, the 3rd move, for the rest of the abstract, which is pretty common in an abstract, and about half of it or more than half of it will be the occupation of the niche. So the student gives the purpose of the research, discusses the method that will be used, and then has a couple of lines at the end on the significance. So you can see all 3 moves being used in this abstract. Let's move on now and talk about the introduction to a thesis or a proposal. So much like an abstract, the introduction has a funnel shape, moving from the very broad general to the specific research. And again, the 3 moves are followed in an introduction. The research territory is established by describing the background or problem. And unlike in an abstract, the literature is briefly reviewed. And you may find the introduction introduces a theoretical framework and defines the terms. Very often this occurs in an introduction to a thesis or a proposal. Then the niche is identified, usually by describing the gap or shortcomings in the research or in the method or findings. And then the niche is occupied. The purpose by giving the purpose of the research, listing the research questions, hypotheses, and objectives. So I've taken the same proposal and I've abridged the introduction to this proposal, and so you'll see there are quite a few ellipses represented by the 3 dots. These are the sections that I've taken out just in the interest of time. So I'll read this abridged introduction and then we can look at the moves. Cold regions and high mountains are sensitive to shifts in climatic conditions and thus provide indicators of climate change. Changes in alpine snow and glacier hydrology impact the water supply. A decreased water supply will impact arid and semi-arid regions. The water resources in the semi-arid Okanagan watershed in British Columbia will be unable to meet increased demand caused by population growth and projected climate change impacts. Mountain snow cover is measured using glacier hydrology models. However, these models may not work in remote mountains where only sparse data are available. As well, these models are likely to be unreliable for measuring future conditions because their empirical components have been calibrated on past behavior. For all these reasons, new models are needed to better measure snow cover and glacier melt in high mountains. Well, the abridged introduction finishes on the next slide. But before we go on to that, let's just see how many moves we can identify on this first slide. Well, you can see here that the student in the first paragraph has established the research territory. I've taken out, as I said, some parts of it, but the student introduces the context, the background, the problem is introduced, and then reviews some of the literature, some of the general literature in the field. Then in the second paragraph, the student immediately gets to the gap. He introduces the methods that are used, the models that are used, and then immediately says that this is the problem with these models. So here he's identifying the gap or the niche in the second paragraph. I'll just read the rest of the introduction. The purpose of this research is to evaluate the impacts of global climate on downstream water resources in the Canadian Rockies. The objectives of the study are as follows. 1, to develop an energy balance hydrological model for the high mountains to study snow and glacier melt processes. 2, to test the model using field data archives and new measurements in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And 3, to apply the model to examine the sensitivity of high mountain hydrology to changes in snow and ice resulting from the change in climate. So this is the last part of the student's introduction. And here you can see he occupies the niche. He gives the purpose of his research, he describes the purpose, and he lists the objectives, 3 objectives for his research. So we can see then the 3 moves working in this abridged introduction. I'd like to just say a little bit about research questions, objectives, and hypotheses, of course, form part of the introduction to a thesis and to a proposal. Now, these should be crystal clear, so they should be written in plain language. And it's a good idea to number your questions or objectives and hypotheses. You could see that the student had, in the introduction we just looked at, had numbered his research objectives and had set them off. So don't put them in a paragraph. Set them off as much easier for your committee to read and to identify your objectives or your questions if they're set off like that. Another good idea is to use the same sentence structure and presentation for each question, objective, or hypothesis. And we could see that in the sample is that the student used the infinitive, the verb to, and then the verb form for each one, so that these are easier to take in, easier for readers to take in if they're done in the same form. And it's a good idea to begin with a central question or objective or hypothesis, and then choose a logical order to present the remaining questions, objectives, or hypotheses. And you'll often want to put them in order of importance. But the order you choose will depend on your particular thesis or your particular proposal. Here are some examples of a student's research question and hypothesis. I'll read this out to you. He started with the sort of general aims and goals. The specific aim of this dissertation is to investigate the relationship between aberrant plasticity and the behavioral and cognitive comorbidities associated with kindling. To address these issues, key questions were asked. Question 1. What is the effect of amygdaloid kindling on operant fear learning and memory? To study this question, I conducted short and long-term kindling of the BLA followed by amygdala or Campbell dependent operant fear conditioning. And hypothesis. Amygdaloid kindling will impair operant behaviors in a stimulation-dependent and task-specific manner. Long-term amygdala kindling will produce more robust behavioral impairments than short-term amygdala kindling. So, and actually the rest of this section went on. It had went on with question 2 and the hypothesis for question 2, and then question 3 and the hypothesis, and so on. And so the rest of the section was all done in the same way. The question was asked, and then the hypothesis was given. So this is a very good example of how you might structure your section on research questions or hypotheses. I want to just say a couple of words about the literature review. And I'm not going to say a lot because I've done a separate screencast and PowerPoint slides on the literature review, which you can find on the Student Service website. So what about the literature review then? What does it do? It presents the rationale for your study. It makes a case for your study. It reveals what is and isn't known about your topic in a synthesis form, so synthesizing the literature. It exposes patterns, gaps, shortcomings, inconsistencies, and debates, but it does so in more detail than the introduction and, of course, than the abstract. And it critiques the literature. It shows and specifically shows how these gaps or shortcomings led to your particular research. It should be logically organized according to the key concepts or themes of your study. So it should have a thematic organization. And as I said, take a look at the screencasts and slides on the literature review. There's a lot more detail there. So to summarize part 2 of the presentation then, use the CARS model to organize your abstract, introduction, and your lit review. And remember, the CARS model has 3 moves: establishing the research territory, identifying the niche, and then occupying the niche. Pay particular attention to the clarity of your research questions, objectives, and hypotheses. And these should be consistently presented using the same grammatical form for each one. And part 3 of this presentation on structuring and writing your thesis will be devoted to the method section, the results section, and the discussion section. Thank you.